All right, guys. So we're going to be talking today about Ramadan, fasting, circadian rhythms, and sort of all things associated with the month of Ramadan, and for what people are going to be experiencing if they train, they do CrossFit, and they're also a practicing Muslim. So what I was doing a couple of days ago was writing a list of recommendations for clients, and a lot of those recommendations were actually from the work that I've done with Dan, who's joining me today. Dan was a nutrition coach for me for about 6 months, and he helped me through quite a lot of things within my nutrition, but mainly as well through sort of assessing my lifestyle and biofeedback within training. And what we're going to discuss today is mainly just sort of the different challenges that people can come across as a CrossFit athlete, or someone that trains for performance, and then also the challenges for someone who's just going to sort of a 60-minute class and doing CrossFit recreationally. And then what we'll do is we'll sort of deep dive into certain things like fasting and hydration, nutrition quality, and circadian rhythms and things like that. So first thing we'll just go over for for the people who are listening to this that don't actually understand what the sort of implications of the schedule and things like that are during Ramadan. So for Muslims that are practicing during the month of Ramadan, what will end up happening is they will fast from food, water, and a number of other activities. But we're just going to go over food and water because that sort of pertains to performance more so during daylight hours. And then what usually happens, especially in Muslim countries, is that there's quite a dramatic shift in sort of schedules. So talking from my own personal experience, I spent 4 years working in Kuwait. I would personally be coaching CrossFit classes up until around about 1 a.m. So we would have people coming in and training, usually for the bulk of the day, from around about 7 p.m., 8 p.m. up until that time. So Dan, let's talk first of all about fasting and, for instance, what is usually done. Sort of the quote unquote benefits to fasting generally. Let's go over food, and then we can go over hydration and water and things like that after.
Yeah. It was really interesting because when in anticipation of this topic, I did something which I do pretty much anytime I have questions, which is turn to research. And I was looking at research being done on possible benefits associated with fasting during the Ramadan period, because it's a great opportunity to kind of test people in a period of fasting where they're almost for sure going to be compliant, right? And you see a lot of improvements in markers like glucose regulation and simpler everyday markers of health. But an important thing to realize there is that a lot of these studies are being done on sedentary people. And, we hear a lot about fasting and other diet trends as well on a regular basis right now. And while I do think they have some advantages, it's important to also recognize that the advantages that any particular dietary strategy have are very particular to the individual. And so when we're looking at the benefits of fasting for your average person in North America or in the Middle East, who maybe isn't exceptionally active, or who certainly isn't training as an athlete, that's going to have totally different implications than for people who are, intentionally applying pretty significant training stress to their body on a regular basis. So, it's in general, even beyond fasting, when it comes to athletes, you have to take things with a grain of salt and consider that some of the, basic everyday recommendations that we're exposed to with respect to nutrition may not necessarily be appropriate to you because of the completely different demands of your body.
So with sort of, you've mentioned there sort of stress. Now, for me personally, I've had a couple of people who, train for performance. They have a relatively high training volume. They'll train for around about 90 minutes to 2 hours per day. You sort of including the just general whole process. and what they've said to me is they said that, you know, for them, that it's an opportunity where they could potentially lose weight or lean up and things like that. So I know that that's an added stress, but you know, like what are the implications for like an athlete who is training for performance, trying to also do something where they're purposely restricting calories and then also performing work, you know, that's not going to be sort of conducive of the whole sort of more performance effect.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think the most important thing to recognize is that, you know, what people are looking for out of training isn't just to go in and execute training. They're looking for the adaptations that come from training, right? It's like, it's when someone hires you as a coach, they're not hiring you to give them 2 hours of work. They're hiring you because they have specific goals that work is supposed to lead to, right? It's like that expression, you know, people don't buy a drill, they seek to buy a hole in the wall, right? And in order to achieve those adaptations, there's something that needs to happen in between the actual training stimulus before those adaptations occur. And that's that, you know, magical recovery space, right? So the idea with training adaptations is, you know, strategically applied stress that causes a disruption in, you know, many systems of your body, to keep it simple. And by pulling back from that stress and other stressors outside of that, your body can recover and adapt to that stress. So if you re-implement that specific type of stress, you can handle it a little bit better. So that recovery period is what we're really talking about here. And when we're referring to food quantity and calorie restriction, when we start to deviate from the amount of food necessary just to meet the basic energy expenditure that a person has on a given day, we're talking about a form of stress that is going to interfere with that recovery process and therefore possibly inhibit these adaptations. So, you know, just looking from energy expenditure and energy intake or calorie intake, you know, at the end of the day, you will expend a certain amount of energy with what you do with your body. I mean, even just being alive and laying in bed, there's a certain amount of energy you're going to expend. And the more active you are on top of that, the more you expend. Your goal should be, as a competitive athlete, to meet that energy expenditure. And, you know, one of the reasons it's so valuable for competitive athletes to have some background with nutrition or have a coach to help them is to help identify what that is. Because when there's a huge discrepancy between the amount of output that you're doing as an athlete, the amount of energy you're expending, and how much you're taking in, then you're going to use that food, that energy, for more critical life functions. And that deficit in energy will ultimately lead to slower recovery and impaired performance. So when we're talking about fasting, we have to recognize a few things. If you can realistically eat an appropriate amount of food in that limited window, then training while fasted probably will be significantly less impactful than it would be if you didn't eat as much. Now, think about yourself, for example. When you're training 2.5 hours per day, the amount of food that you need to eat to meet those demands would probably be extremely difficult to achieve in a fasting window. So just returning to fasting, I realize I've been rambling for a minute here, but
That's cool. That's cool.
I think that fasting for competitive athletes isn't an issue in and of itself. The issue is that fasting will become an issue if in the non-fasted period, in your eating windows, you aren't meeting your energy expenditure, which in the case of Ramadan, especially in, you know, Europe or North America, it's highly unlikely that people are going to be able to achieve their needs. And when we get into specifics, we can talk about specific ways that it'll be easier to hit those goals. But, you know, obviously food quality, water, all of that is important as well. But at the end of the day, I think the food quantity is the big piece here that we need to put attention to.
So yeah, just to touch on that. So for some people, they might not know that the obviously if you're fasting in North America or in Europe, then your eating window is probably, if you are going to be going to bed at, say for instance, a usual time, you're looking at something along the lines of a couple of hours. I know of some people that would wake up before the sun comes up and they would eat before they go back to bed, but again, you know, there's an extremely short window there compared to, say, for instance, if you are based in a Muslim country where the schedules just tend to sort of shift a little bit longer into the night. But I think overall, what we're looking at is just a recovery deficit from just not having enough energy from food.
Exactly.
Now, like, say for instance, if someone is, now I know a lot of people do try to adhere to somewhat of a regular schedule. They might go to bed a couple of hours later and things like that. But yeah, like let's talk about a couple of sort of strategies that might help people if they are looking to. Now, you know, I think we can both agree that, you know, the sort of goal of really achieving sort of performance gains within this month might not be the best thing, but, you know, something more towards maintenance and
Right.
trying to, you know, maintain abilities of strength and fitness and things like that. So let's talk about some strategies. What would you recommend someone doing if, say, for instance, they had a 5 hour to 6 hour sort of eating window?
Well, you know, after fasting for that long, the natural behavioral response for most people is going to be to seek out really calorie dense foods, right? And if you, and I do think that's an important strategy, but you're going to need to be fairly selective with those foods because a lot of cravings that people experience often come from just insufficient intake of things. So, you see a lot of people that I work with who struggle with regular intake of food will often find themselves seeking out really hyperpalatable, calorie-dense foods at the end of the day to make up for that. Your body's always going to find a way to try and get that energy in, right? So it's reasonable to expect that coming off of you know, a more extended fasting period like that, it's going to be really easy to go after things that maybe aren't going to serve you best in moving the needle towards health and performance. So what I'm thinking about is, you know, fried foods and things that are full of you know, kind of crappy fats like vegetable oils, or, you know, in North America, people are going to go for pizzas and burgers and the things that are readily available, where they can get a lot of calories and that are absolutely delicious, right? And that's going to happen for a lot of people, even if they're not trying to do that. Now, I think that when we talk about the demands of a competitive athlete for performance, those like vegetable and seed oil, deep fried things and stuff like that aren't going to serve them well. What we need is easily digested carbohydrate to maximize glycogen storage for performance. So my first recommendation would be conscious about the calorie dense foods, but do seek out calorie dense foods. Rather than seeking out things that are extremely high in fat, we should be looking for easily digested carbohydrates. Obviously, yes, there's a lot of benefit to eating fiber-rich veggies, you know, sweet potatoes over, you know, pasta and white rice kind of thing. But in a situation like this, where I think we should prioritize energy intake to some degree, taking in those simpler carbs, like the pasta, like the white rice, right, like the minimally processed grains, are going to make it very much easier to meet the energy needs than it would be if you were just eating, you know, the most nutrient dense food possible. Okay, so what I would say is prioritize with each meal a large portion of energy dense carbohydrates with relatively low fiber, so it's easily digested. For me, my mind goes to big piles of white rice. I'm sure you can agree with that there, but whatever that is for some people, you know. And then on the side, we add in some colorful veggies to get our micronutrient needs. I don't want to sit here and make it sound like calories and macros are the only thing that really matter here. But since we're talking about food restriction, I think that should be a priority. In the Middle East, I know dates are a big thing, and it's traditional to break fast with dates. And I actually think dates are a perfect example of this kind of food, right? They're, you know, actually somewhat nutrient dense. They have a lot of calories. They're easy to digest. You can eat a lot of them, and you will get a lot of carbs, which will be used to, you know, synthesize glycogen to be used in your training sessions. That's what we'll be relying on when we're fasted, is stored forms of carbohydrate in glycogen. So anything we can do to maximize that storage while we're while we're eating is going to serve us the best. The risk associated with fasting for athletes is when we have insufficient glycogen to meet the fueling demands of our workouts, we produce a stress response, which creates elevated cortisol and a bunch of other things, which are going to lead to more negative outcomes and limit their recovery and adaptations to the training that they have. So I think big thing is easily digested carbs in large amounts. And then talking about protein, same idea here. Obviously, we do need a little bit of fat in the diet. Fat is essential, but eating leaner proteins in order to actually meet your protein needs, again, which are going to be higher for athletes, is a great strategy here as well. And then just being aware of your fat intake to make sure that you're getting a little bit of healthy fat from your foods, but prioritizing the protein and easily digested carbs. I think from a specifics of food selection, that's probably the approach that I would take.
Yeah, like I think that's pretty much what I mean. I know of people who go through sort of training, and they will eat things like dates around their training. They will make sure they're piling up like white rice and stuff like that post training. Yeah. And I think for people who, for athletes that are, taking their nutrition seriously, it's sort of, just another day, but it's potentially just, condensing that into a shorter window. You mentioned a couple of times things about sort of things that are easily digestible. So are there any other strategies apart from like foods and food choices, but are there, potentially any other strategies that they could include to make sure that their digestion is as easy and non-interrupted as possible, like something whether it's like a habit around their eating, or something that they could supplement or something like that?
For sure. Well, interestingly, one of the things that fasting seems to improve is digestion for many people, and the reasons are complicated. So that's something to look out for as an athlete. Fasting is probably a strategy that outside of Ramadan should be used very sparingly in specific cases for an athlete. But while you're doing this for religious and cultural reasons, it's an opportunity to identify possible benefits of this unique dietary strategy that might be helpful for you. So that's something to think about. Pay attention to how you feel. That's something that I cue most of my clients to do. See how you respond to different dietary strategies, different foods, because paying attention to that biofeedback, like you mentioned, is one of the best ways to determine how to make decisions going forward with your food and training and lifestyle stuff. So now coming back to thinking about prioritizing digestion, honestly, I think the biggest challenge that people have with digestion in the modern world is being very distracted when they're eating. Okay. 95% of us, especially when we're not in like a family environment or sitting down to dinner with our partner, which I do expect is a part of what's going on in Ramadan, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I apologize. I'm not super familiar with the traditions of Ramadan, but I imagine that some kind of communal dining experience is part of the tradition.
Like to my knowledge, people spend a lot more time eating with their family during Fitr or Iftar, which is where they break fast, and then as well as that, like there's people go to a number of gatherings where they are eating with friends and family and things like that quite often. So I think that like, as you said, that is something that is a little bit more prevalent during Ramadan.
Yeah. So in a situation like that, my advice is, really try and be present. Enjoy the social connection aspect of food that you're experiencing here. and the way that you're using food to kind of honor your religious commitments and traditions as well. When you're able to engage in those aspects of food outside of, I need to get this in my body to recover from training, that has a significant impact on our psychology and nervous system. And, there's the idea that social connection can help us to move away from that constant sympathetic arousal of everyday life and into a more relaxed parasympathetic state where we know digestion is optimized. Being present in these family gatherings can be one of the best ways to actually make sure that what you're eating is integrated and into your body, absorbed effectively through digestion. And then on the other end of that, what we see a lot is people who are very distracted while eating when not in these situations. It's not uncommon, and I do it a lot myself, and I work really hard to keep this in check, but I'm often on my phone on Instagram or checking emails or, thinking about producing content for social media and stuff like that. And it's really easy to be, to not even remember eating, right? Because I'm so distracted. And what happens when we're that distracted is it's easy to ignore some of the most crucial aspects of digestion, like chewing. I'm not going to sit here and tell people to chew their food 32 times or whatever it is. Okay. Frankly, I think that's kind of like a ridiculous, unsustainable recommendation. But one of the ways you can maximize that, essential aspect of digestion is just to put your phone away and eat your food, not forget that you're eating your food. Sit there, enjoy it, especially if you've been fasting. You're certainly going to enjoy it. And just eat like a normal person.
Put your fork down, talk to people, that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So being present can be absolutely huge. There are some other things, like I'm not super big in recommending probiotics and stuff like that, because we don't know enough about them. And I know that they're kind of like a buzzword and popular in the nutrition space, but a lot of the recommendations we hear about probiotics, there's nothing really to substantiate that. They can certainly be useful in specific situations where people have gut disruptions or dysbiosis, or have taken antibiotics and pretty much cleared out their gut of any bacteria whatsoever. But just implementing them as an everyday supplement is something that I've moved away from, especially in a fast. When people are fasting, I certainly don't think that's necessary. So everything else in terms of specifics would probably have to be on a case-by-case basis. I will say anecdotally, though, some people do find that trying to avoid over-consuming water at the same time that they eat makes them feel a little bit better and digest more effectively. And I think the reasoning there is, whether or not this is very firmly supported by scientific research, the additional water can potentially dilute your stomach acid, inhibiting digestion. But again, this is largely based on anecdote and speculation. But if it works for you and you try it, then I say go with it, because that's a good reference point for nutrition strategies.
Yeah, I think I know I personally, I try to leave a bit of a window between drinking water and eating to optimize digestion. But I understand as well, if you're eating out at a restaurant and stuff like that, it's not going to be as easily manageable. But then I think a big part of it as well is that, if you are drinking a lot of water and you are eating at the same time, you just generally might just get uncomfortable, and it just does.
True.
And it's just, if you're getting uncomfortable after you're eating, it's just going to stress you out, and then it's probably just not what you want. You just want to be sort of more chilled around that time. We've sort of covered food quite a bit, and I think that it's definitely just trying to optimize digestion, but then as well as that, have easily digestible foods. Make sure you have enough carbohydrate and protein, as you said. What now, fasting of water. Now, this is something that isn't necessarily done with people who are doing like intermittent fasting for like, cutting weight and stuff like that. But this is something obviously done during Ramadan, and it does present a challenge. And I think it's probably one of the things that is, I think everyone's focus tends to be towards sort of food and not having food and not having enough energy through that. But I think that dehydration is something that is very, very, very prevalent during Ramadan, and I think it's something that's quite overlooked as well. So, talk to me a little bit about the sort of effects of fasting from water, hydration around training, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, we should recognize that our body is incredibly adaptable. And, yes, you have kidneys and their role is to manage body water. And in periods of time when there's no access to water, you aren't going to be severely dehydrated to the point that, crucial life functions will be negatively affected. But what we're talking about there is the avoidance of getting to a place of severe dehydration that affects our, crucial life functions versus optimal water intake. And there is a difference there, okay? So again, coming back to this idea of adapting to what we do and our exposure to food and water, one thing that I think is important, and maybe the timing on this isn't great, but I think that's something athletes can start to do in advance of Ramadan or very early on, if they hear this, is to start to adjust their water intake around training. If you're used to consuming a large amount of water immediately before, during, and after training, then as soon as you start fasting, it's going to be a much more rough experience than if in advance of the fast, you start pulling away some of that water intake so that you can get used to training without that abundance of water before, during, and after. Now, understanding that you're going to feel a lot more thirsty and dehydrated if you're used to drinking a ton of water around training and then you pull that out. Now we're going to start to make arguments, and this is a big thing that I wanted to discuss about training auto-regulation and making judgments about your training, the effort that you put in to account for that, right? So I imagine we'll build on that, but yeah, first advice would be think about how much water you drink during training. If you're immediately going to stop drinking water while you're drinking a ton, it's going to be much worse than if you have the ability to kind of taper that off and reduce that and let your body get used to a little bit less water during training. So the other aspect is like a lot of people are going to be training in warmer environments, especially in the Middle East. The environment is obviously going to play a massive role here. I hope people have access to air conditioning, as that will make a difference.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, like, that's something to consider. Even just spending 10 to 15 minutes outside getting to the gym or traveling to the gym can be impactful in that regard in extremely warm climates, right? Like, I know I spoke with my friend in Saudi Arabia. It's 35 degrees Celsius there right now. And you know what? Like, maybe it's the fact that I'm Canadian, but that seems insanely hot to me.
Yeah, like, I think, I mean, I've been, I was living in Kuwait during Ramadan at the peak of summer, because it changes every year and it's been sort of shifting forward. And I think it was around about June or July time. So, there was sort of like unreported or like unofficial temperatures of into the 50s, like Celsius, like during the day. So I think, getting into your car is just basically like getting into a sauna for the first few minutes before the AC sort of turns up. And I know that people do, turn their AC on, their engines on for a few minutes just to be able to make it manageable. But so yeah, let's go over. I think let's touch on auto-regulation a little bit. I think that's really important. I mean, I know that I've personally like recommended to my clients that they just sort of see how things go for the first week. They don't really build up too much expectations, and they sort of are comfortable making those adjustments. Like, so I think sort of reducing the expectations and being aware of certain things that you might be experiencing in training and what that means. So let's talk about maybe a couple of sort of biofeedback points that could be related towards auto-regulation in and around your sessions, and what do you think could be adjusted and how that could be adjusted?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'm actually going to backpedal for a second because I realized there's something pretty important to mention with respect to water and hydration.
Yeah, sure.
I've been finding recently that a lot of athletic populations, have this tendency to be super focused on food quality. And there's this thing that happens sometimes where people stop using salt, which is, an essential electrolyte and something we absolutely need, particularly in hot and humid climates. And that's one of the things that's going to significantly impact our hydration status, is having an appropriate amount of electrolytes. So if you are someone who uses salt sparsely, I would highly recommend that you put just a little bit of salt on most of your food. Don't worry about expensive electrolyte supplements and stuff like that. But if you're eating a lot of home cooked whole foods and you have a tendency to avoid salt because of fears associated with high blood pressure and all of the things we've been told about excess sodium, do make sure you are getting a decent amount of salt, somewhere around 25 to 3,000 milligrams per day. And that can easily be achieved by just putting a little bit of table salt on each of your meals.
Yeah, I think that's important. That's something I personally do. I think I saw Stan Effridge, he was sort of saying salt all your meals and stuff like that to sort of keep that hydration up. And I think that's something that I found effective. I was taking noon tablets before quite often, but I've stopped doing that, and now just having a little bit of pink salt with every meal is quite helpful there. Let's go back to the auto-regulation point. What are people going to be experiencing, say, for instance, if dehydration is occurring? I mean, away from just the general feeling of being thirsty and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to understand that hydration status has a huge impact on performance and your experience of training. So a lot of research that has been done on hydration status in athletes has shown that even a 1% dehydration status can be associated with up to 10% performance decrement. So that means we can expect to see standard performance measures as that are regularly used in these studies, like time to exhaustion and rate of perceived exertion. Perceived exertion is going to increase, time to exhaustion is going to decrease. And these happen to be the exact same metrics that are indicative of a suboptimal state for recovery. Like, you see the exact same reductions when there's a sleep decrement or a sleep restriction, or when people are in a sustained calorie deficit. So I think that speaks a lot to how, when we're dehydrated, when we're in a calorie deficit, and when we're sleeping suboptimally or for a restricted amount of time, those are additional forms of stress that take your training stress, you combine them, and now your total stress is significantly higher, meaning that your recovery demands, which we want to counter that, are significantly higher, right? But already impaired because of the calorie deficit, sleep, and dehydration. So you get what I'm saying here. These three things that we've identified as significant factors in Ramadan fasting, circadian rhythm disruption and sleep reduction, likeliness of there being a calorie deficit, and possible insufficient glycogen storage, as well as dehydration. All three of these factors are going to increase the total stress associated with training, increasing the recovery demands, so essentially creating a recovery deficit. So the idea of auto-regulation is, sorry, did you go ahead?
No. You can't carry on. We'll go to sort of more sort of discussion around sleep and circadian rhythms in a bit. But carry on what you're saying.
Well, just coming back to that idea at the beginning, looking at the big picture, when we have the training stimulus on one end, and then the adaptation to training on the other end. You know, we're often so focused on this side of things, right? It's kind of like in dieting. People are always concerned with the calorie intake, but there's another side of the equation, right? The energy expenditure. So we tend to focus so much on the recovery side, trying to optimize conditions for adaptation. And we forget that this side, the amount of recovery that's required, is largely influenced by this side. So if you can manage intensity and be smart enough to pull back, or as a coach, provide guidance to help people figure out when they might be moving into that area of recovery deficit, then we can limit possible negative impacts associated with overtraining and recovery deficits just by reducing the total recovery demands through training, which, like we said, comes from volume and intensity modifications. And different people will respond differently to those modifications.
Yeah, like I think that's an important point, and I think that, you know, the sort of takeaways is people need to pull away from focusing on achieving X percentages or holding X paces that they're used to, and it's more about okay, like what are you able to do, and just being a lot more in tune with your body. And I think that Ramadan, with the restrictions in, well, I mean, because you're going to potentially be in a recovery deficit, and I think that because you know, you need to be a lot more optimal about everything, it does provide the opportunity to sort of have a high stress practice situation of just like being a little bit more in tune with your body, practicing sort of things that are going to be you know, sort of more akin to better recovery in your lifestyle and things like that as well. Let's so you mentioned circadian rhythm, and I think that, you know, this is one of the things that I personally struggled with in Q8. So I was training and I had to sort of shift my whole schedule around, and for about 2 weeks it was a bit of a grind. I was really trying to make sure that I could get enough sleep, and I would finish my coaching, I would go home and I'll try to sleep as soon as possible. But eventually it was just like, okay, this is a lot more difficult, and I just have to shift my whole body clock around. And I was going to bed at 3-4 a.m. and then waking up at midday and stuff like that. But like a shift in circadian rhythm, like what type of effect is that going to have on someone's overall recovery? And, you know, what type of effect is that going to have on, you know, the other factors going on with fasting within, you know, water and also food?
Yeah, I mean, the big impact with changing the timing of your life is that your sleep's going to get severely impacted. And that, you know, I will always argue that sleep is the number one recovery factor. You know, I'm a nutrition coach, but usually the first thing I do with people is check in their sleep and then do everything I can to make sure that that is optimized. Because without that, everything else is just, you know, the impacts of all of the other interventions aren't quite as significant. So we have to recognize that as a very real thing that happens. You know, when we talk about circadian rhythms with respect to sleep, we're talking about the fluctuation of certain hormones in our body that help sleep onset and waking. You know, we talk about cortisol as this stress hormone, but cortisol is an important circadian regulator. One of the reasons that people have many negative health outcomes associated with chronically elevated cortisol is because it is imbalanced and it affects our circadian rhythm and sleep. But what we want to see is first thing in the morning when we wake up, we should have that cortisol spike, which helps us get up and get ready to go on with our day. And we respond very much to natural light to help achieve that. And throughout the day, cortisol sinks down. And as it gets low, melatonin production increases. Melatonin helps us fall asleep, and that's what, you know, governs this sleep-wake cycle that we call the circadian rhythm, which has profound impacts on all systems of our body. So, you know, first thing is just recognize that your sleep is not going to be as good or as long. You know, quality and quantity is going to suffer. You should be able to assess that based on how you feel when you wake up and how you feel during the day. You know, if it's taking you a while to get acclimated to your day, if waking up to an alarm clock is really brutal, and you know you're resisting it and it feels like you just got torn out of deep sleep, and then midday when you know you should be kind of at the peak of your activity, if you're feeling sleeping and feeling like you could go take a nap right now, that's important feedback that indicates that sleep quantity and quality have suffered. And that's the kind of biofeedback we should pay attention to when we consider adjusting training intensity and volume. So one of the things we can try to do to influence that is, you know, if we're adapting to a new sleep time, we need to try and influence that hormonal rhythm. And yeah, I mean, you can go and take melatonin supplements. Those have been great to improve circadian adjustments based on time zones and stuff like that. But one of the best ways to improve natural melatonin secretion is to consume carbohydrate before bedtime. So coming back to the same recommendations, high glycemic carbohydrates consumed before bedtime have been shown to improve sleep onset latency, which is the amount of time it takes to fall asleep, because they, you know, a bunch of stuff happens where these carbs actually allow tryptophan into the brain, where normally tryptophan has to compete with other amino acids, and tryptophan becomes serotonin, which becomes melatonin. So that's a strategy you can implement as well to, again, it's, you know, it comes down to just eating your carbs, which is, this is what everyone needs to be doing if you're competing in CrossFit.
Yeah, cup of white rice before bed. Yeah, that's yeah, that'll send you to sleep. Do you think there are any, for instance, any potential sort of behaviors or things that you can do when either waking or just before going to bed that could potentially just help? I mean, I think everyone knows the whole sort of phone situation and, you know, avoid doing that. But anything else do you think that could be useful to do?
Yeah, I mean, the phone situation is real. And the reason it's real is because our circadian rhythm is largely determined by our exposure to light. We detect light with our eyes, obviously, but also with our skin, right? That's how your skin is somewhat photosensitive. So one of the best ways we can start to influence sleep quality and minimize circadian rhythm disruptions is to try and minimize exposure to artificial lights during a period of time when we're preparing for sleep. So, you know, within the 90 minutes before sleep or 2 hours before sleep. So, you know, that's actively choosing not to engage in backlit screens and stuff like that, which is really hard to do, right? We're all super addicted to our phones. Yeah. And we're more likely to rely on our phones as our little safety blanket when we're stressed out. So that's really hard to do. So something, I know it sounds dorky, but something that I recommend for people that really struggle with that when they need to get their sleep is to get a pair of those dorky blue light glasses. They're pretty impactful. You know, you can grab a pair on Amazon for $20, and they can be really, really helpful for sleep, for helping people who struggle with exposure to light. Another way to manage that would be to try and maximize the darkness of your room with blackout blinds or anything you can do to keep your room as dark as possible when you sleep, and as cool as possible. So, you know, looking at literally pump up the AC. So my wife is obsessed with optimizing sleep, and to the point where it's kind of excessive. And I have to wear a sweater to get into bed because she go into our bedroom and pump up the AC or open up the window in wintertime, and it's freezing. And so it's so uncomfortable. So I get into bed with a sweater and then take my sweater off. But, you know, it really helps. So, you know, she strives for 65 degrees Fahrenheit in the bedroom at bedtime, which is a bit chilly, but it is impactful, and it's a thing that's known to help.
Yeah, like I'm like that as well. It's sort of just sort of putting the AC on in winter and opening up the window in winter. Back in the UK, yeah, but I find it helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was funny. Like I think like this week, like I was. I mean, I do a pretty good job of just like managing sleep and not looking at phones and stuff like that. But then I think I watched Game of Thrones before I went to bed, and I was just like, I was just fucking hyped, and that was it. I was just stuck. I couldn't. I just couldn't sleep, and I had like the worst night's sleep ever.
Some people think that like watching TV helps them fall asleep, and while that may be true, it's kind of like drinking alcohol, right? Like some people swear that having a glass of wine helps them fall asleep, and it's probably true that it helps them like go from a state of consciousness to unconsciousness. But in both cases, there are residual impacts that negatively affect sleep. So yeah, I would certainly be careful of that. But I hear you that sometimes sacrifices need to be made.
Yeah, just wear a hood, put your blue light blocking glasses on, you're safe and you're good to go.
Exactly.
I know we'll get wrapped up in a second, but one other thing I wanted to just touch upon about the sleep, just because I know a lot of people do it. So to my knowledge, a lot of people have like a reduced work schedule in the Middle East during this time. They finish earlier, and there's usually sort of this 3 to 4 hour period after work where people, a lot of people go to the gym to do fasted cardio, which I don't necessarily think is the best idea. But a lot of people nap as well. Do you think that napping is a good thing to do? Do you think that it's going to be effective? I know that some people say that it's great. Some people, I know that you have people who, for instance, work night shifts, or that they might be like first responders and things like that, and they rely heavily on napping. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I am 100% team nap, and I will say like getting like 8 hours of solid undisrupted sleep is better than 5 hours of sleep and a 1 hour nap or a 3 hour nap even. That is going to be better overall. But when we're talking about athletes that are in a recovery deficit, that nap is going to be massively impactful. Understand that you might be a little bit groggy right afterwards, so you might need some time to get up and acclimated to your day. But we're talking about athletes specifically, and I feel strongly that accumulating sleep, even in like disrupted chunks, can be really impactful positively for athletes. Whereas doing fasted cardio, especially in a state of insufficient energy storage, is just adding to the recovery deficit, right? Yeah. Because like we said, fasted cardio isn't in and of itself bad. It's bad when there is insufficient fuel, because that creates a stress response that just keeps us moving backwards rather than forward.
Yeah, like I think that the napping is a huge one, and just being, I always sort of notice that like CrossFit competitions, you usually see some of the best CrossFit athletes tend to be just very, very, very chill, and they might be just napping in the warm up area, and it's 100%. Always they're going through a weekend where they have like a recovery deficit, and they're napping and they're just staying chilled, and then you see some people who might be there and it's like one of their first competitions or something, and they're just absolutely hyped through the whole thing. But yeah, I think we touched on some really good points there. Eat your carbs, make sure you're taking track of
how you tuned on my bicep or something.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right, man. But yeah, I think hopefully people will be able to pull some good nuggets away from this and put something into practice for this next month. Where can people find you and sort of like get a little bit more content from you and things like that?
Yep. I'm on social media on Instagram primarily at Coach Dan M, which is mostly nutrition and fitness content, and occasionally videos of my pets. So if you're resistant to that, then maybe not the best fit for you. I just recently launched my nutrition coaching company, I've been doing it for a long time under other companies, but it's called Evolve Performance Nutrition. And the website is just that.
Awesome.
Actually, it's www.evpnutrition.com, but I think both will link to it. It's relatively new, but I'll be sending out a mailing list starting soon, and you'll be able to sign up for that on the website if you're interested in hearing some ramblings about fitness and nutrition, particularly with respect to CrossFit.
Man, I mean, I love the stuff. You gave me some good tips for the CrossFit Open. All around eating more carbs, but yeah. What I'll do is I'll put up some links at the bottom of this YouTube video. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, man. And I think we'll connect sometime soon. Talk about more sort of nutrition, performance topics, and things like that.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome, man.